Ray tracing running on consoles? No, you're not mishearing that. We went over to Crytek's HQ here in Frankfurt in Germany, and we were able to check out ray tracing running on the Xbox One X in a version of Crysis Remastered. And here to talk about that today and how this ray tracing runs on consoles and how it looks, I'm joined by the very man himself, John Linneman. How you doing there, John?
I'm doing pretty good. And yeah, like you said, we saw it with our own eyes. It is real. Ray tracing on Xbox One X and PS4 Pro. But of course, this does come with some caveats to consider. But still, it's very, very impressive.
Yeah, I guess the place to really start is the technology behind the ray tracing itself, which it first starts with something called sparse voxel tree global illumination. SVOGI, we've talked about before on the channel because CryEngine's one of the few ones that use it, and it's also found its way into other games like the Tomorrow Children, but it's a pretty rare feature on this generation of consoles. Famously, Unreal Engine 4 cut it out before it had its first releases on consoles because it was too expensive, for this current generation.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. But I mean, Crytek's implementation here is fairly impressive and extremely scalable to the point where we actually saw SVOGI in action with Crysis Remastered running on the Switch.
Yeah, right.
And, as I noted in that, they're basically constructing this sort of like representation of the game world using voxels. Kind of around the player and off across the environment, and they're able to use this for constructing their sort of diffuse lighting from the sun, the sky, and everything else.
Yeah, and this step that they used is actually slightly noisy because they use something called very thin cones. You can either trace rays or cones in ray tracing, but with hardware ray tracing, they always use simple rays, not cones. But since they use these thinner cones, it requires a denoising step, which kind of allows them to use triangle ray tracing as well, which is the second step that they have on top of this diffuse SVOGI global illumination. And the ray tracing step, which traces triangles with rays, much like it does in the PC games like that use RTX style ray tracing or DXR style ray tracing. This covers the specular reflections on objects around the player view. So like you can look at like a sheet of metal, or maybe you could look at, like a sheet of glass or something like that, and the reflection in there would be covered by this triangle ray tracing.
Yeah.
And it's all done in software, essentially. And it's very expensive. It's very different from what we find on PC in that aspect because it's not hardware accelerated. It's just all running through compute.
Which is something we talked about when they first showed off the RTX stuff on cards, is that you could theoretically do this using compute shaders. And it's no longer theoretical, of course, as that's exactly what they've done here. But naturally, it is expensive, and there are limitations in terms of just how much they can actually draw. And we'll discuss some of those limitations, of course. But just seeing it in action, I think, was really kind of neat. Like you said, obviously, metal surfaces, glass, things like that reflect, but also other materials such as the nanosuit material. You can actually see other reflections within that material, and it's just this fact that if it's using the correct material, you can see reflections on it, which gives everything a much more realistic and natural appearance.
Yeah, and that's especially important for Crysis because the first game, when it came out, really didn't do these kind of materials very well at all, actually. It's one of the weaker spots of CryEngine 2 Crysis. So seeing a console do it so much better and also kind of filling in these reflections with real ray tracing, and it's the first time to my knowledge that we've seen this style of ray tracing done for reflections on console.
I think it is the very first time. We should note then that the first limitation to discuss here is that this only applies to the pro grade consoles. So that means Xbox One X and PS4 Pro both have ray tracing as an option, but the base consoles certainly do not. And along with that, that means that on Xbox One X you get a maximum resolution of 1080p, and the PS4 Pro is just below 1080p. And in both cases, dynamic resolution scaling is utilized, although it's extremely granular, I found, and you can actually see it. They left the display info panel on
so cool
during our testing, so you can actually see the resolution change in real time as you play, though it does generally hold at 1080. But you can also see, if you look up here in the upper right corner, you'll notice something that says BBH instances, right? And this is actually one of the key limitations of the console, in that it's limited to 150. So why don't you explain more about this, Alex?
Yeah, so basically there's a range or a radius around the player model where there's a BBH structure built up. It's kind of managed by the CPU and it's offline, and it's built up in a range around the player, but it can only fit in so many discrete instances because otherwise it becomes too expensive to maintain on console. It's all updated on the CPU here. So they kind of limit the distance of it and also the amount of objects that can appear in it.
And this directly impacts the reflection that you see. But one of the most interesting things, though, is that because we get access to the console, there is a CVAR that allows us to show sort of the debug view of what is actually being included here, the BBH structure, I guess. You kind of get to see all the objects that are going to be rendered out into your reflections. And it's kind of neat to see.
Yeah, it's cool. You can see like the unfiltered shadow maps in there, but you can also slightly see that the scene geometry itself is a bit simplified. It seems to not use the highest LOD always for every single object. And I guess another thing to see is you really can't see it too well here in this debug view, but no skinned objects. Another optimization that they have is no skinned objects. And skinned objects just means geometry that deforms and usually is animated in a certain way.
Which means like character models, weapons, things that can move around the environment. So if you walk up to a shiny surface, you're not going to actually see one of your teammates reflecting in it. You won't see yourself reflecting in it, in fact, just the environment around you. This is something reserved for the hardware accelerated version available on the PC.
Yeah, and that should be interesting to check out when we do. Another thing that you can kind of see here that's really cool is if you do go into this debug view, if you flip off in between it, on and off, if you actually look at the edges, you can see another optimization they have where the internal resolution, the game's running at 1080p here on Xbox One X, but the internal resolution of the ray tracing itself is 540p. And in a very interesting way, they called it interlaced ray tracing, where it's done internally at 540p as we understand it, but every other line in one frame, so 540p in one frame, and another 540p in the other odd lines in another frame, and they interlace them together, kind of like Killzone Shadowfall multiplayer component when that initially came out.
For the overall resolution, yeah.
But this for the overall resolution of ray tracing. And it works out really well. You don't really notice it at all when you're walking around and looking at the reflections. It does a pretty good job of, I would say, reconstructing up to a higher res.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is because it's limited to the reflections here, you actually can't really see any issues with this. It looks very clean, it's very accurate. But the thing that I found interesting is obviously there's limitations on how far out you can reflect. So they actually combine this with two other techniques. And this is something that I think we'll actually see a lot going into next generation to make ray tracing possible at a high speed, where they're using ray tracing for near field objects around the player, near field scenery specifically. But what about things at a distance? What about actual dynamic objects? Well, for that, they're using a mix of planar reflections and, of course, the venerable screen space reflections.
Yeah, it does a pretty good job because it catches things like particles in the game, all the dynamic character objects, some of the other smaller dynamic objects, and it really fills them out and makes the scene look much more real. If you look at something like Unreal Engine 5's Lumen system, it actually is kind of similar. It's this tiered system to get a variety of ray traced effects, some of which is in screen space. So this is almost like another version of that, but brought to, something like an Xbox One X. And I guess really the last real optimization that it has that'll be different on the PC version is that the ocean doesn't use the ray trace reflections,
That's right.
but rather just SSR and planar reflections. But since it's an ocean and it's just flat anyways, you actually really don't notice. Planar reflections are really good for that kind of a surface.
Yeah, I mean, looking at what they've done here, visually speaking, I think it actually works out fairly well, and it's really remarkable to see it. And this is actually just one of 3 modes available on the consoles. So currently on Pro and Xbox One X, you have the option to run with ray tracing enabled at 1080p or lower. There's also a high quality mode, which bumps it up to native 4K at 30 FPS on Xbox One X, and I think it's 1800p on PS4 Pro, also at 30 frames per second. And then lastly, there is a performance mode, which is actually the base console version of the game running without a frame rate cap.
Yeah, which is interesting to say the least, because even in this, I would say, optimize post CryEngine 3, whatever this weird version of CryEngine it is on now, version of the game, Crysis 1 is a very heavy CPU game when you get to those places like in the town, when a bunch of enemy AI is going around, there's explosions, happening here and there. Tons of stuff is interacting. That's where the PC version back in the day slows to a crawl. And even, if you play it in back compat, it's not going to be too great on Xbox One.
Didn't they say that they were still using Lewis scripts for the AI, which is kind of insane, actually, because that really hammers the CPU hard.
Yeah, it is. I guess that's kind of the legacy aspect of it. It would change for Crysis 2 and Crysis 3, obviously, but I don't think this 1080p unlocked mode will always be 60 FPS, especially you get to areas like that where there's a bunch of AI interacting, but something that down the line Xbox Series X will definitely clear up, I imagine. Probably run it really, really well.
So yeah, I mean, that was kind of it. Just seeing this working at all was honestly surprising and impressive to me. Walking up to, like, say, a metal transformer or some sort of object and just being able to peer in and see the world sort of reflected in a very subtle way, but a very realistic fashion just around you.
Yeah.
It's really neat to see. It really feels like they're putting this very impressive foot forward. And I think Crytek itself is responsible for all of this ray tracing implementation in this remastered version.
Yeah.
They're working closely with Saber Interactive to develop the remaster, but I think they did a lot of this stuff in-house as well.
So it looked really wonderful on Xbox One X in this 1080p 30 mode, but at the same time, what do you think they're going to be doing in the future here, John?
Well, I think this is sort of a first step forward. It shows that their solution with software ray tracing is extremely performant, and it can be scaled down far enough that it actually works on hardware that you wouldn't expect to see it on. The fact that we're seeing it on these machines, to me at least, feels almost like some sort of a miracle.
Yeah, right.
But it really showcases some impressive technical results. But as a result of those limitations, it's not going to stand out like you might have expected with ray trace reflections. And what I think this, and I kind of mentioned before, this really sort of sets the stage for the future. Like, we've discussed a lot about what the new consoles can bring in terms of hardware ray tracing. We actually don't know yet what they're truly capable of on that front, but ray tracing is still a very expensive technique. Finding a way to marry high-speed ray tracing features used for select passes with other more software-driven techniques can create something that's very effective. They'll be able to take what they've done here and push it much, much further on PS5 and Xbox Series X, provided that it actually gets updated for those consoles, because for now at least it supports backwards compatibility.
And in this case, I think the backwards compatibility, if there's any other frame rate problems, it'll clear it up really perfectly. And I would really like to see them do an Xbox Series X patch or a PS5 patch for this game. They could turn up the resolution, turn on some of those things that are going to be limited to just the PC version at this time period. I would really like to see them do that. I guess we're going to have to wait to see how that turns out after those consoles finally come out.
And of course, software ray tracing is available on the PC as well, so it is quite playable and looks excellent and superior even just on a non-RTX enabled graphics card.
Yeah, it's going to scale up basically in resolution and a couple of other features over this. So that's something I'll talk about though when the PC version is coming around, since we got some good info on that.
I think the big takeaway is that I'm really impressed with Crytek pushing these advanced features on hardware you wouldn't expect. Like, we saw it with Sfogy being implemented on Nintendo Switch, which surprised me already, and then we see it again with actual ray tracing on a PS4 and Xbox One X. And just go back to when these consoles were still new. Just ask yourself, did you think we would ever reach this point where we would see any sort of ray tracing on machines like this?
Nope, not at all. I can quote myself here. From the past, I was very skeptical that when they put out that publicity blurb about this game having ray tracing and it didn't say only on the PC, I was like, no way they're running this on console.
First time Nintendo Switch.
Yeah, I don't know about that. It needs more combos. It needs more ellipses, 2 points for Crytek, minus 2 points for Alex there. But John, thanks for talking to me about CryEngine ray tracing in Crysis Remastered on Xbox One X and PS4 Pro.
Yeah, of course.
And if you did like this video of John and I talking about this subject, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out and see more videos like this in the future, support us on Patreon to get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to John or myself about Crysis Remastered and ray tracing on Xbox One X and the like, write a comment below or follow John and myself on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you auf Wiedersehen und
farewell.
We have to go now!